Shabbat Shalom. So this week's Parsha opens the book of Devarim, and it begins the great retelling of the story of the Israelites in Moshe's words. And just as the Israelites are on the verge of great change, a transition of leadership, they are about to enter the promised land, Moshe tells their story, highlighting certain elements, I believe, to steer the Israelites toward overcoming the uncertainty that awaits. Now for us, we're on Shabbat Chazon, Shabbat of vision, just days before Tisha B'Av, fearing an impending larger war in Israel, and in a year where we have so much to mourn as Jews. Also seem on the verge of some sort of change, or something might change. But before the story is even retold in the Parsha opens saying that Moses addresses the Israelites at this place, at this time. And then it says, after defeating Sihon, king of the Amorites, and King Og of Bashan. Now I found this fascinating, that there are a lot of enemies in the Torah, including the biggest enemy of all, Pharaoh, and maybe these were the most recent ones, but also they're mentioned here in this prominent place, the beginning of Devarim. They hold such a sway in our tradition that we recall these two names every Shabbat morning when we sing Psalm 136, Ki le'olam chasto, for God's love endures. And so while I wish I could dive into both, I want to focus on Og tonight. And this in part because I was fascinated by a pasuk later in the parasha. So Moshe is retelling the Israelites' journey, their struggles, the triumphs, including about Sihon and Og and the defeat of their people. And Moshe said, only King Og of Bashan was left remaining of the Rephaim. His bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbi of the Ammonites, but it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So if a cubit is roughly 18 inches, give or take, that means Og's bed is 14 by 6 feet. So maybe he's 13 feet around that to fit in the bed, to warrant a bed that big. And the Rashbam also points out that the word for bed, eres, actually means crib. So is this a baby bed? Is he a giant in a crib? What is happening here? And either way, this is wild to happen at this part in the retelling of the story. So our rabbis speak a lot about the legendary, mythic, and large nature of Og. The rabbis say in Midrashim that he can lift up a mountain. He was around as early as the time of Abraham. Another Midrash says that he was around during the flood with Noah, and he was so large he sat on top of the ark and survived with Noah's family. This is a legend here. So this giant, Og, our rabbis say is not only huge, but he goes back to the beginning of the creation almost. And besides that Og is huge, we also know that he was the only one left remaining of the Rephaim. Now Rashi points out that Rephaim here is the same as the Nephilim, both words for giants who roamed the earth after the Mabul or the flood in Genesis. And that word also appeared a few weeks ago. I spoke about in Shalach Lecha when I shared with you about how the scouts saw themselves as grasshoppers in the eyes of the Nephilim, or the giants they encountered. So maybe here we found a reason that Og has such prominence in this retelling, if we connect it to Shalach Lecha. His presence as a giant here reminds the Israelites, again, if it's the same story, the same fear as in Shalach Lecha, it reminds the Israelites how fear can take over their story, and they see themselves as small. It doesn't mean their challenges weren't real, but like in Shalach Lecha, there's an implication that Moshe is warning us up front about how moments when we see ourselves as small, we might not actually be as small as we think. Moshe wants the Israelites to understand that there's always been an Og, and there always will be an Og. As a people, There are still giants today that make us feel small. In our eyes, they make us feel as if they're an insurmountable enemy that we can't conquer. As individuals walking in the world, there are still giants that we look at and feel we're not good enough, or we don't have the strength to overcome that giant. So maybe it's the prominence in this retelling that reminds us of how important it is to flip this battle, the fight of the narratives. The narrative actually lives in our head, and we can tell a different story. So during these days leading up to Tisha B'Av, we mourn all the calamities and destruction our people experienced over the generations, particularly the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Second Temple. And there have been real giants in our people's history, as seen by some of the tragedies we mourn this week. There's real pain and destruction, and there are real giants now. And yet we're a people who knows something about dusting ourselves off, standing up from the ashes, and telling a new story grounded in hope. As Shuli mentioned last week, the 10th of Av will come after the 9th of Av. But to get there, I believe the Torah we need to see from the prominent place of Og in this parasha is that with giants around us, we have the power to internally change the story we tell ourselves, particularly about our relationship to the giants. We might not always have so much control over the external giants in our life, but we can control how we see ourselves. Moshe instills this confidence within the Israelites to internalize before they go to the promised land. He reminds them at the end of the parasha, do not fear, ki Adonai Elohechem hu hanilcham lachem, for it is your God who will battle for you. It is not my theology to say that God necessarily fights our external battles for us, or maybe that's a whole nother sermon or text study. However, I interpret this, do not fear, for it is God who will battle for you. Do not fear these stories in our mind. Do not fear this narrative that we are small, because we can see ourselves as bigger and stronger and more courageous. And that's where God lives. And there's another midrash that says Moshe was actually 10 cubits tall himself, and he was able to take an axe and kill Og. And there's some dispute about Og's real size, but based on his bed, Moshe would be almost the same height as Og in this rabbinic retelling. So even the rabbis see a world where we are as big as Og and can look him in the eye on an even playing field. So as I wrote this, Kavannah, I wanted to write, as a people, we can flip the narrative and say we are strong, we are united, and we are moral in this moment. We can overcome the challenges that face us in Israel and here. But as I started to type that, I realized it's not true. We are not united. We are not all driven by what I and many of you might see as moral. And for this, during these days, I mourn. However, on Shabbat Chazon, we are offered the opportunity to have a glimpse of hope with what's internally possible. And after the low point we all will experience on Monday night, then we have the opportunity to dust off our clothes again, rise up from the ground, and hope that we can turn around our people's story and begin the work of tshuva as we head into the High Holy Days. We will rise up with hope, and we can reunite our people once we flip the story about who we are up against in our minds and who we really are. So on this Shabbat, may we find the space and courage to look at our stories, to examine how we see ourselves and the journey of our people, and let God guide us to know that we are the same height as the Ogs we face in our world. And with that renewed sense of confidence, may we then prepare for Tisha B'Av, and after experiencing that low point that morning, may we begin to rewrite our narrative, the narrative of our people, to be one of hope and courage, to be one of morals, and to be the light among the nations that we aspire to be. Shabbat Shalom.